Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. There is a jackhammer working right outside of the apartment, so I'm going to try to do this between any construction. I will warn anybody if there's any audio spikes, I'll try to cut them off, but if you're listening on headphones, I won't let anything crazy in there, nothing ear-blowing, but prepare yourself for maybe some loud hammers in the background now and then, and I'll try to redo any sections that has any loud noise, but anybody that's been listening for a while knows I got to just work with what I got here. And what I have is a very, very noisy neighborhood. So let's jump in and keep our fingers crossed it's not too bad. Buster D had a few questions. First, they were thinking of getting one of the Weya arcade monitors. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, my apologies, and wants to know if I have any experience with those. Most people on the Shmups forum have been satisfied with them. There are some naysayers on Facebook, but one person indicated that they should be recapped or given cooling fans. So I can't speak to those individual monitors at all, but what I can do is just give some general advice about buying stuff like this. So the capacitors is way easier to explain. Every capacitor is eventually going, especially the electrolytics, is eventually going to die. It might be because of heat, and they might leak out or dry up, or it might just be because they've sat on the shelf for so long that they died. And of course, heat and humidity have so much to do with all of this stuff. So it is absolutely plausible. I don't know how likely it is, but it's plausible that you'll get an arcade monitor that brand new old stock that would need a recap right away. Now, this is definitely true with Game Gears. In fact, I've heard people buy a sealed new in-box Game Gear for an insane amount of money, like $600 or something, opened it up, turned it on, nothing. They opened the case, found leaky caps, there you go. And that was for one that was never, ever used before. I don't hear that a lot with CRTs, but every CRT is different. Where were they stored? If it was from Taiwan, is it right by the water? I spent years bouncing back and forth between Taiwan, so, it's an awesome place, but it's a very humid place too. So that's, I guess I would buy any kind of CRT at all. New, old stock, old and beat up, whatever it is. I would buy all of those with the expectation that you're probably going to need to do some kind of work on them relatively soon. And if you don't, hey, consider it a bonus. But I would keep that in the back of your head as, whenever you purchase something like that. As far as the brand and anything like that goes, maybe 10 years ago I would have had some different advice on pick this brand, pick that brand. But nowadays, if you get a CRT that works, it's better than everything else. Next, do I have any recommendations to things to practice recapping on? So I guess I would always start out in the same way. I would pick something that's a worthless piece of electronics board. Maybe you go to an electronics junkyard and you see something smashed into bits and there's an electronics board there with a bunch of electrolytics on it. Start with that, because it doesn't even matter. And in fact, you could even desolder the old caps, practice cleaning, and then just solder them back in, because it's not like it's a working piece of electronics. So you could get used to stuff like that. And then, if you're going through consoles and you're confident enough that, you at least know sort of what you're doing, Super Nintendo is always a good one, because most of them don't need it, and there's only like 5 or 6 caps. So I would just look for anything with the smallest amount. And there also a lot of the consoles like Super Nintendo, they're in an area where there isn't a whole bunch of other stuff, so you could take your time, and even a total beginner could probably pull it off in less than 2 hours, going very slow, taking your time, going through everything. And then, you said, how could you eventually get good enough to recap things like your PVM 20L5 and this arcade monitor? So, and you also mentioned a PC Engine Duo. Here's the final piece of it. And here, I would never discourage anybody from doing their own work, but here's the reality check, I guess. I am absolutely good enough at most of this stuff to, if nothing goes wrong, hold my own with some of the really talented people out there. But when something goes wrong is the problem. And I think I've used this example before, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but Jose came over and we were both recapping a 32-inch CRT. And, I took a board, he took a board, and we're doing our thing. And I only had one set of good cutters or something, so I ended up just using a crappy one, giving him the good ones, and I pulled up a trace. In hindsight, I probably should have taken the good ones because he doesn't need the extra help, but whatever. So now I'm stuck, right? If he wasn't here, what am I going to do? Like, I could trace it all back with a multimeter, but I'm not really good at that. I don't have a lot of experience in that. And luckily I picked it up, walked across the room and said, "Hey dude, I broke this." And he fixed it in about 2 seconds and everything worked fine. So when it comes to things like recapping an arcade monitor or a consumer grade TV that you're able to pick up, go for it, right? And if you break it, that sucks. But hey, if it's good glass, a good tube, then find another one that's the same model and maybe just grab the board out of the inside. And now, start working on that. And even if you end up fixing the original again, now you have a backup. So I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing that. But a 20L5 is a rare and expensive monitor. So I wouldn't recommend anybody dive into that unless they have some serious experience. And in fact, I would almost recommend doing a BVM first, because you could take out each one of the input cards and work on them. And worst comes to worst, if you break it, you're out a couple $100 for a new input card. It sucks. It's annoying, but you don't have to worry about, how am I going to get this giant monitor somewhere to have a professional repair it? Just recap one board at a time. And if, you recap boards 1 and 2 and everything's fine, you get to board 3 and it doesn't work anymore. You did something wrong on board 3, send that one out or buy a new one. Whereas a 20L5, technically you could do that, but because there's multiple boards inside, but you have to disassemble the entire thing. You would have to be in pieces. You would have to recap it one board at a time, put the board back in, test it. So it's, I wouldn't ever discourage anybody from doing that. I just want to give realistic expectations of, if something goes wrong, it's going to be a lot more challenging on something like a PVM than it would be anything else, pretty much. So hopefully I put that into perspective. Also, thank you very much for all of the kind words. Definitely appreciate that. And hopefully I kind of straightened things out a little bit. IB Bangin tried to follow up with a question last week about the PVM, but I forgot that it's really hard to upload pictures on any of these sites, and they wanted to know what's the best way to get a hold of me or send me further information. They tried adding me on Twitter, but I imagine they got lost in a sea of tweets. So first, to answer your question directly, stuff like this, especially if it's in the contents of the Q&As, upload to like Imgur or one of the free image file hosted programs, and then just link to that in this. If for whatever reason you can't post a link, which I'm pretty sure you can because people have before, try to message me directly through one of the platforms or something. And also I know this sucks, but please be a little patient with Floatplane because it's a new service. So both I'm not 100% sure how to use it, and I think they're still they're constantly making a bunch of awesome changes. So my apologies for that. But yeah, direct message onto the support platforms, upload pictures somewhere else if you have to. And just a note about social media. I would like to have the time to sit there on social media and kind of go through everything. But I get swamped daily with messages. And there are some days that I know this probably isn't the right thing to say, but I'll open up Twitter and I'll see that little 99 for next to the notifications, and I'll just kind of refresh and then just walk away because there's just not enough hours in the day. And I know you're not accusing me of anything. You were very nice in the question. I'm just trying to explain to everybody that a bunch of times I've gotten people very, very upset that I didn't respond to them, especially things like on YouTube where I use the community manager and I try to read all the comments, but I can't get to them and I can't get to replies. So if somebody says like, hey, where do you get this thing? And I drop a link to it and I move on, I probably won't ever see their response to that. And some people have gotten really upset about all that stuff. And I don't have enough hours in the day. Maybe someday if the channel gets super huge, I could hire a social media manager to check every single post and try to get the good info out there for people. But, people get really upset on both ends because I'll say things like, hey, if you're a supporter and you're part of the Q&As, then please just drop the questions here. And I never miss, and if I do, it's a mistake and I get back to it. Whereas some people appreciate that, and other people go out there and they're like, listen to this giant piece of shit who's charging people to answer questions. And it's like, they're not wrong, but that's obviously not what this is all about. And I would hope that everybody that subscribes to this understands that. But I've heard some pretty big named people with a lot of followers say that. I even had one tell me that it's disgraceful that I'm charging people to be part of my Discord. And it's the opposite. The support part came first, and then the Discord part came because people that were talking in the comments were like, hey, talking in comments sucks. Why can't we just have a place to talk to each other? And I'm like, I believe it was Vanessa that came up with the idea of doing that. I don't want to point the blame on her now. Oh man, I hope I didn't just send a bunch of hate her way or anything. But when Vanessa worded it to me that way, I was like, oh, that is actually a really good idea. So, I'm sorry to ramble on about a question that should have just been post to Imgur and respond again, but I just always try to keep things into perspective, because so many people nowadays are so bored because they have nothing to do at home, and they're in a bad mood because they're scared and they don't know what's going on, and the only way they know how to react to it is being hateful online. So if I have to be that target, fine. If I'm really the only person you could harass that day, I'll take it. But I just want to make sure it's in perspective. I don't want anybody to think like I'm intentionally ignoring you or anything like that. And it's hard too, because a lot of people have different names on the support services that they do on social media. So somebody will say something on social media and I'll respond super quick. It might even come across as snippy just because I'm, waiting for a subway. I see the train coming up and I'm like, oh, let me respond to this real quick before I lose service. And next thing you know, somebody who supports is like, why, Bob's in a bad mood or something. And we just had this conversation over on Float Plane, but now it's snippy on Twitter. What's up with that? Like, I never mean any of that stuff. So, I'm usually pretty clear whenever I'm intentionally rude, and it's usually in response to something where if you knew the whole story, you're like, that's fair. Maybe not the smartest way to respond, but totally fair in context. So I just wanted to put a little explanation behind that so people really know where I'm coming from. And my intentions 99.9% of the time are always going to be good. And the only time I'm ever really upset is when I misunderstand. I'm human, it happens. Or when people really cross that weird line, So sorry for the 4-minute response to, go on Imgur. My bad. And speaking of making mistakes, over on Patreon, Matthew Underwood said, hey, looks like you skipped my question. I distinctly remember responding to your question, which means I probably deleted the file in post before getting it into Premiere or something like that. So my apologies. Or if you just missed it by accident and I'm responding twice, my apologies to everybody that hear it twice, but whatever. I'm going to do it anyway because it's probably my fault. The question is, hey Bob, I'm the guy whose wife doesn't like the noise from my CRT TV. I saw your video about using CRT monitors with VGA and decided to give it a go. Unfortunately, my results were quite disappointing. I don't have any idea what I'm doing wrong. I'm using a RetroTink 2X Pro and the exact HDMI VGA adapter from your video. Everything just looks dark and washed out, and it looks like it's blurred horizontally, if that makes any sense. When I use the 240p test suite and add a white line to the bottom of the screen, it looks vivid and bright. When I add it to the side of the screen, it looks blurry and dark. I've tried this with 2 different VGA CRT monitors, and when I hook them up to my PC and run an emulator, they look vivid and bright. I'm running composite, by the way, but I don't see why that should cause the level of difference I'm seeing. Do you have any ideas about this for me? I'm going to keep experimenting. Thanks. So first of all, thanks for the reminder about the previous conversation. I'm usually good at remembering that, but who knows? Maybe you catch me on an off day. So I did definitely remember this, and I think I said that last time when I responded, but must have deleted. So a couple of things. You tried 2 VGA monitors, and you tried hooking it up directly to your PC. So you've already gotten your troubleshooting skills down, so props. On the RetroTink 2X Pro, are scan lines on? Because I did have an issue with a prototype, but I didn't think was part of a production run, where the 2X, I think it was the 2X SCART, when just going through clear, no filtering on it, it looked fine. When using the filtering mode, it still looked fine, but scan lines drove a VGA CRT crazy. It just didn't know what to do, and it kind of gave the same thing that you described. So I would try that. If you have access to any other equipment, even borrowing from friends or something, try any of the other things. Try an OSSC, try a Dreamcast with a VGA cable. Just kind of give something else a try to see. Definitely just check the 2X Pro, update the firmware, downgrade the firmware if you already have the latest version, grab one of the old ones. Mike doesn't lock stuff down like that, and it's mostly ridiculous when people do, so you could feel free to just load whatever firmware revision. And to answer your other question about composite video, that should not make any difference at all. The only difference should be exactly what you saw in the VGA monitor video about it. It's just not going to be as clear, but it should not cause any of that interference. So I'm going to save this file. Do not delete, double check, and hopefully this will be in this week's Q&A. Alex Shamai said they recently saw on Twitter that Aaron from Chimeric Systems had a new firmware for the OG Xbox and was supposed to address the black level issue that they posted about a while back. He said he had some beta testers look at it on 100 different displays to get the balance right. I was a little confused by this update because in the past he said he would have needed to provide the option of several different firmwares to address all of the possible causes of the black level issue, and that he didn't have the manpower to do that without raising the price. He also estimated the issue was only affecting about 1% of people's setups. But when I asked you about this, you confirmed my suspicion that it was more widespread when you said you get asked about it a lot. So my question is if you were one of the beta testers of the new firmware he was mentioning, and if you have any more info on its effectiveness. I'll also mention that I did buy his adapter months ago and ended up returning it because not only did it exhibit the black level issue, but it also had a clear purplish pinkish hue. So I think I got a defective unit, sounds like it, but I don't think that would have changed the outcome with regard to the black level issue. So there's a few things in there, and this is a little bit of insider stuff, so I'm going to try to make it quick so I don't bore anybody with it. But first, it turns out that like I discussed before, a bunch of people were messaging me about it on different platforms under different names that were the same person. They weren't harassing me. They weren't trying to do anything nefarious. It was just, they didn't know how to get a hold of me. So I'm seeing all these messages pop up, but it was really only a handful of people when I finally checked up with it. I did talk to Chimeric Systems about it, discussed all of the stuff, and he said he figured out a few tricks to try to get around that, to try to do some kind of, I don't know if he's doing auto detection. I don't want to speak for him at all. All I know is that he did say he eventually tried to figure something out. But his comment is 100% true about, I don't have the manpower and the different displays to do that, because if he wasn't able to get people who already owned it to reproduce the problem, how could he possibly have figured that out on his own? And I'm not looking down upon your comment, and I'm certainly not crapping on any small companies, but just the fact is, if you have a product that works 99% of the time and you can't figure out what's going on that other 1% of the time, and your choices are, lose all of your money by hiring a bunch of people to do the testing, or, try to take the market off the product, or just offer refunds to people who have the issue. And maybe I'm wrong, but it's my personal opinion that for a small company, that's just what you should do. A lot of people disagree, and there's even one company we all know of that releases one product every million years because they refuse to know that they're releasing a product with 1%, or in the case that I'm thinking of, way less than 1% of the people that buy it might possibly have issues with certain scenarios. And a lot of people just won't go down that road if they know it. And it's my opinion that it can't, we're talking about making original equipment work on new displays that they were, in most cases, they weren't even designed when these original things were made. So yeah, I'm sure flat panels, everybody knew they were coming out, but the original Xbox was really just designed for, CRTs that never would have had this issue. So designing an adapter that makes it work on a flat panel, it's impossible to get it perfect. There's no way, especially because a lot of the HDMI Licensing Association's specifications have changed so much over the years. I won't go down that road of complaining about that scam of a company, but the first batch of flat panels worked totally different than this batch. So, in the latest couple of years. So it's just impossible to get 100% compatibility. So I do absolutely defend Chimeric Systems' stance on this because I've been there. I've been in a small company that designed products, and I do help consult on a lot of people doing stuff in the retro gaming world. So I just wanted to take the time to respond to you properly about this, because I feel like if I just said something like, it stinks that you were part of the 1% or less, but that's how life goes. I didn't want to cheapen the problem that you had, and I also didn't want to make silly excuses. I kind of wanted to give it more context just for anybody listening. So, but unfortunately, that is the end result. Is, hey, I'm really sorry you were part of the 1% that had the black level issue, but maybe try to pick up another adapter with the newest firmware, or just use a different solution. There are a few Xbox HDMI stuff out there that don't that aren't terrible. And of course, the internal one is going to probably be the best if that ever comes out. So I would kind of hold on for those. Focus had a couple of awesome things to say. First, random, but if there's a way I could send you a whiskey, let me know. All this drink talk makes me want you to try my favorite. So I was just talking to Firebrand X about this the other day because he also enjoys different types of alcohols and stuff like that. And shipping booze is such a freaking challenge. Every state has different laws. Every shipping company has different laws. So no, I would never recommend you try to ship me anything like that. Not for any reason other than I don't want you to end up getting in trouble shipping me something that breaks or gets sent back to you. So no, just I do keep a list of all the recommendations. I do send it to my buddy AJ from Answer Infinity, who also enjoys this stuff with me too. So thank you. It was a very nice thing to offer, but definitely don't, because probably just going to end up a disaster, and I would feel really bad. But other questions. With Raspberry Pis being more accessible, and specifically the 4 being out, are they potentially viable as an open source upscaler if they get a special hat to receive input? So it's got potential to, but the people that are working on the Pi as an upscaler for old computers so far say that there's not enough color data. The pins don't support enough color data to make it happen. I'm both oversimplifying and probably getting that wrong, so respects to that team, my bad. But so I talked to other people about it that said it should be theoretically possible, but they don't have the time to look into it, but they'll try to. But I agree, even if it was half a frame of lag, because you'd probably have to buffer at least a few lines of code, I would think that's a completely awesome solution. I know this is weird to say, but there's a bunch of studies out there of how much lag matters, and it's always out of context. The only studies in context I've heard is professional gamers on classic consoles. That's an important one. Anything pre-frame buffer era, you could tell at about just over half a frame of lag, you won't be able to do some of your special moves and stuff like that. Now once frame buffers came in, once wireless controllers, different story, just talking about classic stuff. So if they were able to pull that off with half a frame of lag or less, I think that would be an amazing solution. But I don't know how feasible it is in the near future. And also the Raspberry Pi 4 still has missing drivers and issues with drivers. I guess somebody told me a story about how the person in charge of the drivers quit the team right before the release or something, and that's why over a year later it's still technically an incomplete product. Could be total bullshit. That could just be internet lore, but sorry for perpetuating it if that isn't true. Another quick question. I've been interested in getting light gun games working on my projector. Do you think it's possible to get various consoles' gun con games working? The best chance seems to be something like Duck Hunt working, but things like Virtua Cop and the Saturn would probably be a long shot given the required change from 15 to 31 kilohertz. I believe they require that 15 kilohertz signal to be processing. Plan is the 2x SCART into the HDMI to VGA converter you've already recommended. Also, if there's any open source thing out there, I'd love to take a look and see how I can contribute back. The closest thing I think might be the Sinden light gun, and the person who designed it said they took a look at the OSSC and they think it's possible to have either a special firmware or something up with the OSSC that could draw that border the Sinden light gun requires, that would allow you to use it with all consoles without any mods to the console at all. You plug the controller in I think it would require something like a Raspberry Pi to go with it, some kind of controller box, and then plug it into the console, plug it into the OSSC, and that could work. But I don't know. I mean, I think the people involved in that are just struggling to make sure to get the product out with everything else going on in the world. So at the moment, I don't know of a good solution that isn't emulation. You could use emulators and the Sinden light gun or anything like it, but or of course the Mister, same thing. Maybe try that. Maybe pick up a Mister, but Mister's not going to run Saturn anytime soon, or if at all. So yeah, sorry, I have no better question for that. But I am a fan of light gun games, so maybe I will go back and relook at the Sinden and possibly pick one up for testing when it comes out. I do think that one's going to be 99.9% emulator only at release, which is fine. I mean, it's step one. So we'll see how we could integrate that into other stuff. Timothy Barup has very politely reminded me that I was an idiot last week and forgot the number one step. He didn't use those words. Those are my words. Here is what Timothy had to say. In response to the Dreamcast question by Demon Boy Jr., I recently recapped my Dreamcast that has a USB GD-ROM and had a similar problem with the system shutting down near the end of the startup animation. My problem was that my fan plug was not fully connected. I'm using the 3D printed adapter for the Noctua fan, and it was not the connector to the controller board, but where the fan plugs into the adapter cable. Also, the fan didn't spin, so that's a pretty easy thing to look for. I assume it's a thermal protection. The other issue Googling led me to is the ribbon cable from the motherboard to the controller board, but reseating that cable and trying another cable had no effect. So yeah, my apologies to Demon Boy Jr. and thank you to Timothy for reminding me of this. If you ever have Dreamcast issues where it just won't get past the boot screen, the fan is the first thing you should try. I was so deep past troubleshooting in that for my personal Dreamcast, and I still think it's the knockoff GDMU that I bought for testing. But I totally forgot to mention the simplest solution. So yeah, if your Dreamcast doesn't boot up, if it boot cycles, I would say if it gets past the boot animation, you're probably gonna have to look at other things, but shine a flashlight, just grab your cell phone light and shove it into the side of the, actually I have a Dreamcast right here. just have your flashlight go right here and see if you could see a fan blade spinning, and if not, that's the first thing that you should check. You should look in and see if the fan is spinning, and if not, I'll try to follow up and see what else was wrong with my Dreamcast. Patrick Working wants to know if there's ways for people who want to get modern content on a composite video CRT, which I think is awesome. I think there's a whole bunch of different things that's a perfectly good scenario. Patrick pointed out that, you could use the Raspberry Pi with composite video out, but they were wondering if there's HDMI to composite converters or even USB to composite video cards or something like that that could be implemented. So there's two ways to go about doing this. If you just want to watch TV shows, so like let's say you have a bunch of content, Netflix is a perfect example for this, but you get a bunch of stuff from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that you want to watch. That was originally shot in 480i and meant to be watched on an interlaced, CRT television. You could get I've seen a bunch of converters out there that go from HDMI in to composite video out. Now, these are designed for stuff like this, so I imagine in most cases they would probably all have a lot of lag. For TV, that obviously doesn't mean the slightest bit of a difference, or I guess if you're playing a computer game that's like a turn-by-turn adventure point-and-click game or something like that, totally different story. So I would give those a try, and you could also give that a try with computer games and pretty much anything else that's HDMI as well. But there's two factors. First, of course, there might be a lot of lag. You'd have to try it to see. I haven't tested any of them personally. And they're probably going to convert everything to 480i, never 240p. So if you're looking for 240p, that's a different story, and I only have half the answer at the moment. So for anything that's 480p, you could make that 240p with the GBS control software that I just did the video on. Dan Mons chimed in about that. And that'll downscale that to 240p without any kind of issues. I think you might be able to go down to 480i, but in the context of this, you're just really going to want to worry about 240p. The only problem, though, then you would have to take the GBS controls output of either component video or VGA and make that into composite video. And that's the missing piece of the puzzle. Now, there's one open source project that's not quite working right yet, but it's still getting there. It's the one Mike Shee mentioned. That you could try that to see if it works. You'd have to build your own, of course, and you'd have to do so knowing that it's still a work in progress. And there's a few other devices that people have talked about mentioning for a few years now that do exactly that. They would take a VGA or component signal and convert them to the proper 240p signals of composite video and S video. Now, those are not downscalers. You would have to feed that 240p VGA, so like a 15 kilohertz signal, but it would do that. But they're not out yet. So my suggestion to you would be to start with any of those HDMI to composite converters. Enjoy Netflix and any other TV or movies on that now, and give gaming a try. And if you're going for those, point and click adventure games, you're probably never going to care about the lag, and interlaced might annoy you. But if you really are looking to game like that, give it a little more time. I'm hoping by the end of this year, the products would be out like that. But I'll keep everybody updated the moment they're released, because, I do, as I've been annoyingly reminding everybody lately, that there's nothing wrong with composite video on a CRT. And if you're looking for a CRT experience, it's awesome. So good question. Sorry, I could mostly answer it for now. Normal Guy wants to know if there's any word on Atari Jaguar controller overlays. I haven't heard anything at all, but hopefully with the ROM cart being out there and, interest in all classic stuff starting to go up, I hope somebody else works on it. And if anybody hears anything, please let me know. So for anybody unaware, a few Atari Jaguar games came with these overlays, and they were things that slid into the middle part of the Jaguar controller that that basically just labeled the number buttons. So it was a fancy label with like embossed over each button, so you didn't have to look down. You could kind of feel with your thumb where each button was. And instead of having to remember that button 1 is, move left or something, it would just have all of this stuff written on it. So I don't know if it was necessary for any game, but it certainly added to a few. And then one company a couple of years ago came out with some aftermarket ones and made for pretty much all the games out there. And it was cool because games that, had the feature to use the buttons but never had an overlay now had that option. And now you had an easy way to get ones that weren't the originals. But they were super expensive. And, they were excellent quality, but it's my personal opinion that if a version of those were available now that weren't as nice but were much cheaper, they'd probably sell a lot more. So the original company making the aftermarket ones aren't making them at all anymore, and I don't know of anybody making any of them, but please, somebody do that. Even if you do a limited run or something, and you just make one for each official game and just kind of go from there. I think people really would buy that. You're not going to sell you're not going to be a millionaire and buy a house with the profit you'll make, but you might make enough to at least make it worth your time to have them printed. So hopefully people out there are still caring enough to work on stuff like that. Question from Louis Zezeran. What's up, Louis? Good to see you, man. Or good to hear from you. I did an interview with Louis a while back in New York City that was a lot of fun. So unfortunately, with the world shutting down, I'm not sure when we're going to be able to run into each other again, but hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. Anyway, Louis's question. They have a Mr. I/O outputting RGBS via the D sub to my BVM, and it works great. They had an idea to connect the Mister to a consumer-grade TV with a SCART input, and being in Estonia and Europe, you have SCART inputs on their TVs there. Jealous. They have an extra VGA D-sub to BNC cable, and they were thinking that they could chop the BNC ends off and solder on a SCART head to achieve this. Do you think I would need any resistors in the SCART head for this? So on the RGB lines, definitely not, but on the sync line, yes. But I wish the Mr. team would come up with a different solution for this. So I saw your question. Actually, I was redoing the Normal Guy question, and then the jackhammer started. So I took that time to measure it, and I'm looking up right now on my oscilloscope, and it says, hold on, let me get the 1.16 volts on the sync line with 75 ohm termination, which means that that's definitely... It's, in my opinion, too high to go into a SCART device. It shouldn't kill it, but it's not what I would like to send. So I usually try to aim for around 500 millivolts. We had a whole bunch of discussions on the Retro Roundtable of, what's the right voltage, what's safe, what's not safe. And I think, and I might not be 100% on this, but I believe SCART devices accept composite video on the sync pin, and the full composite video voltage is about a volt, so it shouldn't be an issue. But if you're going to make your own cables, I would just add a resistor to the line, probably a 470 ohm. Jake Lancaster chimed in about, you could probably anything around that, probably 300 to 600 should be fine. I talked to a few members of the Mr. team. I'll mention it to them as well. Maybe they could add some kind of option for what the sync level would be. Is it going to be RGB HV? Is it RGBS TTL or RGBS 75 ohm? So, I don't know if there would actually be a danger of you not adding it, but if you're making your own cable, just throw it in there, because there's certainly the worst thing that could happen if you put too big of a resistor on the line is that you don't get a signal. That's it. It's just not sending enough voltage to the TV. So throw a 470 on there, you should be fine. Something a little bigger, a little smaller should be good. But, while with video signals, it's always best to measure and it's always best to make sure you're doing the right thing, I can't think of a scenario in which sending too little voltage would do damage, especially for a short term, turn it on and see if it works. Whereas there is absolutely a chance that sending too much voltage, even in a just turn it on and see what happens scenario, might actually cause an issue. So throw that resistor on there and you should be good to go. 2 questions from Connie. I think I'm saying that name correctly. Since you're cleaning all of the controllers you get, have you ever tried to use an ultrasonic cleaner? No, I don't know if I've ever even seen one in person, or maybe I have and I just forgot that I saw it, but I certainly don't own one and don't know anybody that owns one, so I have not tried. And I also haven't felt the need, because when I remove every component from a controller, scrub the plastic with a soft plastic brush, so many people still comment like, oh, you're going to destroy and scratch your controllers. It's a soft plastic brush. It's not going to scratch anything. But, I do get in there with the bristles and I make sure to clean all the nooks and crannies. And if a controller is really bad, I use Goo Gone first to get the funk off and then wash that off. But when I put everything back together, maybe I might see 1 or 2 more spots as I'm reassembling, and then I just use isopropyl on a Q-tip, and it feels brand new in most cases, so I've never felt the need to. But if you think that there's any reason that an ultrasonic cleaner would add something to that, please chime back in again, because I certainly, I'm always willing to try something, especially if they're decently priced. Next question, which actions would you recommend to fix issues with PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 not being able to read discs reliably or at all? So first, clean the laser, just isopropyl on a cotton swab, clean it, just in case, even if it looks clean, you never know. Clean the discs. I'm assuming that you already tried that, otherwise you wouldn't have asked the question, but, make sure the discs aren't dirty and stuff like that. Other than that, now you're starting to get into troubleshooting. Do you have a scope? Are you able to read the voltage of the drives? Can you adjust the potentiometers? If you don't know how to do that, if you don't have a scope to do that, you're just guessing, and you could just burn out the laser by doing it wrong. Are there cheap kits available for laser replacement kits? If that's the case, maybe it's worth it to do that. And of course, is there an optical drive emulator available if you'd rather use that? So I wish I had more things to offer on this one, but other than clean it and make sure it works, there starts to get into a bunch of troubleshooting steps that could get complicated. So if anybody else has ideas on that, please chime in. But, I really could only give you the first steps, and then you're going to kind of have to decide how far you want to go with it afterwards. TJ wanted to see if I could help on the result they're getting with modded and non-modded systems using the Rad2X and M Classic. On non-modded systems, PS1, 2, and Saturn, the Rad2X plus M Classic in Classic mode gives a 1.21 aspect ratio instead of a 1.33, whereas in pass-through mode, I get the normal 1.33. In the internal HDMI modded Dreamcast and GameCube, all output the correct aspect ratio in either mode. Additionally, the RGB modded NES, SNES, and Genesis using Rad2X output the correct aspect ratio. Since they use a projector, they notice there's a ratio about 4 inches thinner on each side of the non-modded systems. It would make sense, because if a giant screen means a small difference is actually a big difference. They have a feeling it's just how it is, but they're not sure why. Any insight would be great to have. So I don't know if there's anything you could do about that. I think it's probably because the Rad2X tries to process these at the correct aspect ratio, and I'm not sure what the M Classic does in combination with that. Also, it's my opinion, just an opinion. This isn't fact, but Dreamcast, GameCube, and original Xbox, if you have any kind of HDMI adapter, I think work really, really great through the M cable, M Classic, whatever, game mode versions, of course. I think it really is a very cool effect. I have never liked the effect on any other console. I think, just opinion, I think the smoothing filter for PS1, 2, and Saturn was just as good, if not better, in certain scenarios from the Rad2X and RetroTink products. So I would just I would spend some time with your favorite Saturn game, your favorite PS2 game, with just the Rad2X with the filter on, and then turn the filter off and add the M Classic and really see how you feel about that, and just kind of keep an open mind and think, let me just see what I really enjoy and see if this is really what I'm looking for. Because I've never found a use for the M Classic for 2D graphic games, and I didn't really like any of the tests I did when I did the Saturn comparison of it, and I threw the PlayStation on there. So I guess if you really do like the way it looks, which is nothing wrong with that because I already proved it doesn't have any lag, so it's not hurting anything, then you'd have to ask yourself what drives you crazier, not having the M Classic or not having the proper aspect ratio. So I'm sorry I don't have like a good answer for that. I could just offer perspective and tips and stuff, but it's definitely how I would start. Jason Guffey says, I know this is something you've mentioned before several times, but I figured I'd ask because what the hell. What do you suggest I do to keep my precious controllers safe from my gross slimy fingers after long play sessions? Should I be stopping to wipe them down every hour or so? Do I wear gloves? I think I've heard you mention a good rub down with Goo Gone, but I want to be sure since I've had similar products melt plastic in some cases. Like I said, I know I've heard you talk and write about this before, but I figured I challenge your no stupid questions principle. Thank you very much. And also you liked the Pyron interview. Thank you. That's I like Gabriel a lot too. That was a great interview. But so I would suggest doing my cleaning method where you take it apart. Start with just dish detergent, basic stuff. I use the organic because it's all the supermarket down the street has. But I mean, pick whatever you got. It should be fine as long as there's no like corrosive elements to it. And then I don't know how much I would worry about that during a play session. But it's kind of funny because my hands don't really sweat too much while I'm playing video games, but playing guitar, especially on stage with lights on you, I never knew. I used to make fun of a friend of mine who, he shaved his head in his late 20s because he didn't want to have that bald look. And every time he played a show, he'd bring a fan and sit it in front of him. And I would always make fun of him, like, oh, are you just remembering the hair you used to have blowing in the fan on stage? And he never said anything. And then I finally played a bigger gig that had a ton of lights on stage, and I was drenched in sweat in like 30 seconds. And that's when, and you can't even like wipe your hands on your shirt because then your shirt's soaked through anyway. So I would keep like a towel or something with me, just in case it got real bad. One of the last shows I played, it was the hottest I'd ever played on stage before. It was nuts. One of my friends was at the show and thought like I spilled water on myself. It was so bad, but not to gross anybody out, but I would just keep it dry, both because you want to grip while you're playing. And then when you're done, you could get those like alcohol wipes or something like that, where you basically just wipe the controller down, and that should help. But if you're just really sweaty, which, once again, I'm not talking down to you. Clearly, I just told the embarrassing story. If you're just really sweaty, I would just plan on wiping it down with some alcohol wipes every time you're done playing, and then disassembling it and cleaning it out every once in a while. It is interesting though, because I wonder how that affects electronics. So for a guitar, as long as I don't have active pickups and I'm sweating right in the pickups, it shouldn't be too big of a deal during, on stage and stuff. But with a controller, I'm not sure if it gets really humid or really moist, if that would affect the electronics. But I mean, if it's a serious issue, if there's any time to pause, save the game, and swap controllers with another one, that's always something you could do, I guess. But it's an interesting question. But I would just start out treating it like I'd treat my sweaty guitar, and just wipe it down as necessary, and then use some alcohol wipes afterwards, just for anything else. Kirk said they were about to purchase an Otaku SCART switch and noticed they are selling one with a SCART to component transcoder built in. This would suit their setup great, and the extra cost for the switch is about the same as a decent SCART cable I would need to buy. Without testing it, do you believe having it in the one device could present any interference issues? I currently use a transcoder I bought off a New Zealand seller on eBay, and it works really well, but being able to have all in one device seems a lot easier. Also, I really enjoy the interviews and hope to hear some more of them. Thank you very much. That's an interesting one, Kirk. If you already own the one from the New Zealand seller, I think you're talking about LinuxBot 3000 is the seller. I've talked to him a few times. I have a couple of his products, and they all seem good. I haven't done in-depth testing on the transcoder, but it's really hard for me to recommend something that I haven't tested over something that people have given me very good feedback on. I don't think there would be any issue with the Otaku SCART switch. I've spoken to the people that made that a few times, and they seem like they both know what they're doing, but they also really care to make a good product. So I don't think they would ever release something that sucked. But, once again, you have something that you already know is working for you. So I think I would just break that down to convenience. What's the easiest thing for your setup? Is having everything integrated in there really going to be a giant help for you? Then give it a try, especially if you could turn it off. Because, what if it's not as good? What if it's good, but yours looks a hair better or something? Then you could just get a SCART cable and do it and hook it up that way. So for me personally, I don't know. That's a tough one. I think I would just base that on convenience more than anything else. And I would eventually like to test both of those on a scope and make sure all the levels are correct and all that stuff. But yeah, that's a tough one. I guess I would just pick whatever's most convenient. Well, that's it for this week. I think I was able to cut out any sounds and re-record any part that ended up with any loud blasts in there, so hopefully this one's okay for everybody. But it's 1,000,000 degrees in here, so I am going to go turn on the air condition and go render this video. So as always, thank you all very much for your support, for participating in these, and just for being awesome. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next week.